Good morning, YouTube. I got something a little bit different for you today. I'm pretty excited about this one. I think it's interesting. I hope you like it too. But on a recent trip to Death Valley, I had a routine where I would spend my morning and early afternoons in the Badwater Basin area. I would get up hours before sunrise and then try and find a good composition for sunrise. And then after the sun would come up, I would look for interesting mud textures while the sun was still low on the horizon. By about the second day, a very long day of staring at mud, I started to get extremely frustrated. I felt like no matter what I did, I just wasn't able to capture everything in one shot. I'd find interesting compositions, but I couldn't quite get it right. I would either go in too tight and miss key details on the periphery, or I would go too wide and lose some of those subtle details that would shrink as I moved back. Additionally, I wanted to make sure I was going to be able to maintain enough detail for a large print. I had visualized this huge monochrome print on the wall, and I wanted to have so much detail that I could stand just inches from it and not just see an ant, but see a shadow. I decided that in order to get that level of detail, I would need to use a telephoto lens and stitch several images. The problem with that is even though I had a nodal slider, because I was using a long lens and was very close to the ground, as I would rotate left and right while shooting straight down, the distance from the subject to my lens would change. So if you think about how a nodal slide works, it does correct for certain types of distortion when you're stitching images. So if you think about it, if you hold your hands up and you were to line up an item in your view with both eyes open and make that item in the center of your hands, as you close your right eye and your left eye, that item will move. It's the same for your camera. As you're rotating left and right, the objects that are in the field of view are going to converge and separate based on how you rotate. What the nodal slide does is it offsets so that rather than rotating the front element around, you're rotating on that nodal point or no parallax point, so that as you're rotating, those lines in the distance stay the same relative to each other. And when you go to merge them in post, you don't have any issues where they're here in image one, and by the time you get to image two, they've moved, right? And then you have distortion. So it does fix for that. But what it doesn't do is, say you're facing a brick wall and you're 10 feet from the base of the wall and it goes off in either distance. The distance between me and the wall here is 10 feet. But then as I look to my left and my right, it goes off 30, 40, 50 feet. Now, my distance from the base, if I were to continue to move to the right, is always going to be 10 feet. But by just looking, I'm increasing that distance. So the bricks would look a lot smaller as I look to the left and the right than they do directly in front of me. And then those lines would start to converge. The only way to correct for that would be to move to the left and the right, and that's what we do with the slider. We put the slider on the base, and then the lens stays in the same plane relative to the ground, and then we move left and right. In this way, the textures don't change in size and shape as we're moving to get these multiple images. And the end result will be a series of images that maintain the same distance from the subject, in this case the ground. And as I reviewed the images, it revealed an added benefit I hadn't considered in the field. As a viewer of these types of images, it unmoors you from that central focal point. If you think about how most people view an image printed up on the wall, they look at it the same way the camera does. They stand in the center and they rotate their head around to take it all in. With these images, you would actually be able to move your feet to view different portions of the image, just the way you would if you were evaluating the scene. As you would move, the perspective of the image would move with you. I'm sure at this point I sound like a crazy person, but I'm really excited about this technique, and it really worked out well, and I can think of a ton of images I've shot in the past that would have benefited from this, so I wish I had thought of this sooner. But seeing as how about 92% of my viewing audience is my wife, and I can just feel her rolling her eyes at me at this point as I'm jibber-jabbering about maintaining distance between subject and lens, I just want to show you some images, and then we can come back and we can talk about the technique and how I wanted to play this in the future. And I know I said good morning and I have a beer. It's like 10 o'clock at night. I'm playing a drinking game. This is like take 850, and with each take, I take a sip of beer, and it just gives me something to hopefully keep me from waving my hands around like an idiot. So, cheers, babe. Okay, so this first image here is a perfect example of what I was running into before I thought of using the nodal slide. So as you can see, compositionally, it just feels crammed to me. I really liked this feature here, and I liked these deep lines and all the texture that was in the mud, but I just felt like it needed more. I felt like if I could just come back a couple of feet, that I would be able to capture more of a panoramic view that felt more like what my eye would see. And then when I would zoom out with a wider lens, I would lose some of these key details, like this would feel small and insignificant in the frame. So it just didn't work for me. So I look at this image, it's not bad, it's not what I wanted. So in this next image, this was the first composition that I utilized the slider for. Now, immediately you can probably see that on the bottom here, the texture as it gets smaller is consistent from left to right. So if we hadn't used a slider, what you would see is the texture would look this way in the center image, and then on the sides it would get smaller, and it would feel as if almost it would give the perception that there was almost a slant away from you, which is the reality. The distance changes. But more importantly, not just the perspective, is that if you look at the level of resolution, so I've got a 34-inch monitor here, and as we zoom in to 100%, you can see that I can pick up individual rocks, individual cracks, the gravel in between the cracks. There's just an immense amount of detail. The level that I'm zoomed in here would be the equivalent of like an 8-foot print. And that's way bigger than I intend to go. But just knowing that I could and still have the level of detail that I want is great. So this is the first one, and ultimately I think this is one of my favorites. I really liked how this line coming in here, it almost gave the impression of like a bird's wing. So you have these major lines coming in here, and then these would be the equivalent of the feathers as you go down the wing. So I just felt like this was a really interesting texture, and I liked how it went from larger cracks on top and they continued to get more and more gradual as you worked your way to the bottom. This one here is, to be honest, I'm not sure how I feel about this one. I still want to show it just for the same reasons, but it just gives you an idea of how much different texture there is here. This almost gave me the feeling of looking down at a field of clovers, which I felt was interesting. But again, as we zoom into 100%, you're able to pick up individual grains of sand in between each of these cracks, and just an immense amount of detail. So this, to me, is what draws me in, because even compositionally, I'll be honest, I don't love this image, but if I were standing in front of this print, as large as it can be printed, I would just be taken in by how much detail and how much there is to absorb and see. And it would, just like when I was standing in the mudflats, just looking at every detail and trying to just take it all in. And when you're able to share that with an audience, I think it's a pretty amazing thing. And it's what I love about photography. So this is the type of stuff that I really like to do, is take a scene from nature and try and share it with an audience in the same way that I experienced it. And I think that that's really what this technique allows you to do for scenes like this. So this is another composition that didn't work the way I wanted it to. In the field, this is the one I was most excited about, which kind of always how it works out, isn't it? But this reminded me of a tree. Obviously, you have a trunk here, and then you have your two branches coming out with the texture radiating outwards. This is a perfect example of why I think this texture is so great, this technique. If I hadn't used a slider, so this center portion here would be my first image, and then you have your side portions here. If you look here, the texture in the middle is the same size as the texture on the edges. If I hadn't used a slider, you wouldn't have this evenness on the branches. It would look like, again, the branches were folding away from you. And by using this technique, you do get the illusion that this is a tree of cracks, which, again, compositionally, it's a little bit too busy for me, and it didn't end up working out the way I had hoped. But I think it's a perfect example of why this technique has so much promise. And again, I love zooming in to see all the little tiny details. Now this one, at first glance, was not my favorite. I really liked these textures on top. I wish that they had continued downwards. I do like this crack here, how it sort of divides, and the image is very balanced to me. But just as I had started to set up, I watched as this ant was working his way around the top, and I just waited, just hoping that he would come down to the bottom. And like I said, I don't just want an ant, I want his freaking shadow. This is my favorite image from the trip. And the reason is because I just think it's so cool to capture such insignificant and minor details that most people probably wouldn't care about. But to see an ant in perfect size and shape, but also his shadow in perfect sharpness, I just think it's such a cool thing. And again, if I were standing in front of this very large print and was able to catch that minor detail, I just think it would make the viewing experience so special. So this is the key of this entire technique is the ability to not just maintain perspective, but to bring so much detail to the viewer. I mean, these are all essentially 200 megapixel images, and you can go much bigger than that. I was limited by my gear because I hadn't anticipated doing this, and we'll talk more about that here shortly, but there's definitely a lot of ways that you could do this a lot better than I did. But overall, I'm very happy with this because even in the corners, you've got excellent sharpness and a ton of detail. So I think that this definitely is a proof of concept that this is a great technique for minimizing distortion, but also for having exceptional detail in the images. So this is a setup that I was utilizing on this trip. This is an FLM compact travel tripod. It's very lightweight, very easy to carry, but the downside is it's not as stable as my other tripods. It's definitely not intended for this type of work. With the leveling base and the camera, it was a lot of weight and a lot of leverage. But the first thing I did was put on a leveling base and level that center part, and I would take a large bubble level and I put it on all four corners of the slider, and that was just to make sure that as you went from left to right, we weren't going to sag or rise as we went across. So I went ahead, leveled all four corners, and then I put the camera right on top, and the camera is sitting on an additional leveling base with a pan tilt head. And the reason is that after I add the camera, it might sag, so I had another leveling base just to make sure it was still level to the ground. And then you can see that I have the lens parallel to the legs. And you might be wondering, why go through all this hassle of leveling everything if you're just going to shoot at an angle anyway? And it's a fair point, and it's one of the things I'll mention at the end of the video. But with the scenes that I was trying to shoot and the gear that I had, I didn't have a choice but to be further away from the mud and then zoom in with the telephoto. And the only way I could keep the legs out of the composition was to have the lens parallel to the legs, and that was sort of the trade-off that I had to just accept. But it was easy to account for because I could just look at live view with the lens set the way it is and then stop down to say f16, and then I could account for that depth of field at the central image. By making sure that I was level, I didn't have to worry about it sagging an inch or two from left to right, because that would have been much harder to account for and you might have had gaps in your focus. So what I did was I stopped down to f16, made sure I was level, and then I was ready to shoot my 3 shots from left to right. Okay, so after a ton of tweaking, I landed at about 135 millimeters. I'll probably crop out the very top portion, but this is the far right of the image, so this is image 1. This would be image 2. And here's image 3. And then here's the final composited image. Okay, well, hopefully you enjoyed that as much as I did. This one was fun for me. I've been looking forward to making this video for a while because I just had a lot of fun out in the field doing this. But this is why I love photography. I've been interested in photography now for almost 20 years, and I still learn something new every single day. I also manage to screw something up every single day, but that's neither here nor there. The point is that the whole goal of this channel is to challenge myself and my viewers to really question how we approach landscape photography. And not just do what we've always done, just because it's what we've always done and it works, but to push yourself to grow and challenge yourself as a photographer. And that's what this was for me. I hit a wall on this trip. I was not enjoying myself. I was pretty miserable. And then messing around with this technique gave me that excitement and that joy to be able to push through. And I came away with some images that I'm really proud of. So to me, that's what it's all about, is just to get better every day. Like I say, every day is a school day, and every day we have to learn and improve. So 2 things that I would probably improve on this is to use a sturdier tripod. Ideally, maybe have a tripod on either end so that you could use a longer slider. This would allow you to have more images from left to right. decreasing the distance from the camera and the ground so that the tripod legs don't come into play as much. Like I said, this was an issue for me there because of what I was shooting. I think this might work better for even more intimate scenes. A lot of what I was shooting was actually quite a large area, so it was hard to get too close and not have the legs of the tripod in the way. So I think I would try and focus more on more intimate scenes. I actually have an idea to take this up to Rocky Mountain National Park and shoot ice textures. And for that, I might even ditch the tripod altogether and just use the feet of the slider, put it directly on the ice with a macro lens, maybe an extension tube, and then just shoot from left to right, and then just slide slightly forward, shoot a multi-row essentially, and focus stack so that I would get the depth of the ice and then obviously a ton of resolution. But hopefully while you're watching this, you came up with some ideas. I would love to hear whether or not you think that this technique would work for you, and whether you think it's interesting and how you might implement it into your own photography. But just want to say thank you if you watched this far, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you next week. Get out there and make some images.